Welcome back to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. Well, as world leaders and some 20,000 delegates gather in Glasgow, Scotland for the COP26 climate summit, they'll be working towards the goal of keeping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius through a variety of methods aimed at reducing greenhouse gases. A lot of the focus is on decarbonizing the power grid, transportation, buildings, a lot of work to do in all of those sectors. But here at the Lincoln Institute, we're especially interested in two areas where the planet might achieve better climate outcomes, and that's the management of land and the management of water. My guest today has been a leader on climate and the environment for many years. Bruce Babbitt, former governor of Arizona, one-time presidential candidate, and former secretary of the Department of the Interior. He's also been a long-serving board member at the Lincoln Institute. And oh, by the way, he is the person for whom the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy is named. That's our center in Phoenix that is doing incredible work at the intersection of land and water, with a current orientation around the Colorado River Basin and the unfolding crisis there, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Governor, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
Anthony, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, let's start off with the big picture, if you don't mind. You've participated in some big, difficult negotiations with a lot of stakeholders in your day. Any global agreement following up on the Paris Accord is another order of magnitude, I understand. But let me ask you, are you hopeful about these talks?
Anthony, the press seems to be predicting disaster. Reading all of the morning news, there's this sense that since China, Xi is not going to be there, since the Russian President Putin is not going to be there, there's really kind of a downbeat tone to the press. I don't think it's correct. I'm a bit more optimistic. The summit is going to be different. Past summits have all been about making pledges. And I think the press is correct saying we don't anticipate another round of pledges upping the ante. My sense is that that's not really the issue. I don't think there will be a lot of new pledges. The question is, how do we move beyond good intentions toward specific programs to actually implement among nations? That's not spectacular work. It doesn't make headlines. But I think there's some momentum there and that there will be progress, even if it's not on the front pages of the paper.
Well, the urgency is certainly something that's palpable, at least among those who have been following this. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warning that global warming has become a code red for humanity. So the stakes are accordingly pretty high. Let's dig a bit deeper. Let's look at those categories of land and water. We want to talk about water and climate in just a moment, but first let's look at land. Among the four goals of COP26, land makes a cameo in this statement about resilience, which I'll just quickly read. Adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, specifically by protecting and restoring ecosystems, and building defenses, warning systems, and resilient infrastructure in agriculture to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods, and even lives. Now, that is virtuous, and land has a key role in building resilience, but I think you might agree that land, including forests of all kinds, but also grasslands and other natural areas, is worthy of more attention. Rainforests are first and foremost really good at soaking up carbon, isn't that right? So should we be looking more at land conservation and figuring out a way to stop all the destruction of rainforest and other natural lands?
Absolutely. The discussions at the summits and even here in the United States by the administration have all been focused on fossil fuels, renewable energy, cleaning up the grid, and electric cars. And I think that's a real problem, that we've got to get land and land use and water, the biological part of this, back on the agenda. It just isn't really getting the attention it deserves. For example, the destruction of forests, including tropical forests, is a huge part of the emissions problem. The clearing of tropical forests now contributes 20% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, equivalent to the entire transportation sector, automobiles, trucks, all of that. But you never hear about it. I would hope that out of this summit, we will incentivize some real attention to how it is we manage forest, land, and water to deal with that 20% that right now hasn't gotten the attention it deserves.
And that's emissions from intentionally set fires and land clearing and that sort of thing?
Well, the big issue is the clearing of tropical and, for that matter, other forests. All land uses relate to carbon dioxide emissions in one way or another, but the forests are the largest store of carbon in the planetary ecosystem. It's easy to understand if you go out into a forest and look at all that mass, which is sequestering carbon. So that's the big problem. The way we manage land, agriculture can either be sequestering carbon dioxide in the way the land is managed, or it can be mismanaged to create even greater emissions. Pretty subtle issues, but again, the percentage of the problem that they create, if they're mismanaged, is very real. That's what we got to work on.
Turning to water, it may be that nothing quite shows how climate change is sort of a many-tentacled crisis than the challenge of managing this most precious resource all around the world. There have been many hotspots feeling the effects of record high temperatures and drought. You might recall some municipalities in South Africa almost literally running out of water in their reservoirs a couple of years ago. But what's playing out in America's Intermountain West is such a vivid illustration of these challenges. Looking at the supply shortages and the agreements in place for distributing the water from the Colorado River to the various western states, which, after all, these are big population centers. We're talking about California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, Utah. Tell us, what is the basic problem in the Colorado River Basin?
The basic problem is too many water rights have been given out, expectations have been raised, and for a century, the government and cities and municipalities have been giving out water that was never there. A second problem is the water that is there is rapidly declining. And I think it's important to kind of emphasize that the reason that relates to global warming and the reason we got to tackle it and do something about climate change is the rainfall patterns are being hugely disrupted. There's too much water in many places and these enduring droughts in others. And unfortunately, the droughts are affecting many of the poorest, least progressive parts of the world where the capacity to deal with it is not there. And it's going to create huge displacements of population, migration pressures. Now, out west, we are in one of these drought cycles. It's being driven by the lack of precipitation, and the increasing temperature decreases runoff efficiency. What rain there is doesn't reach the reservoirs because it evaporates from the soil drying out, from the temperature constantly heating up the landscape. So these are urgent issues that we've got to manage as temperatures rise. We've got to stop the rising temperatures, but we also have to manage the here and now, and we're not doing enough of it.
Well, Jim Holloway, the director of the Babbitt Center, shared some pie charts recently at our annual Big City Planning Directors Institute. And it was interesting, in terms of demand for water in the basin states, agriculture looks like it's far and away the biggest user. So if we look at conservation as one part of the strategy here, if urban areas do their part and link urban planning and the forecast of water supplies, do a better job there, work on conservation, trade in that big lawn for a rock garden, that sort of thing. What are some of the things that big agriculture could do to use less water?
I think we must start by acknowledging reality. Irrigated agriculture, using more than 80% of the water, drives you to ask, how are we going to manage that? And with the onset of drought, the fact is that we're probably going to have to think of ways not only to make agriculture more efficient, but to accept the reality that some agricultural water will have to be transferred to urban uses as urban populations go up. And we're going to have to accept the reality that there will be some reduction in irrigated agriculture. Fallowing is one time-honored tradition. You take fields out of irrigation every other year to reduce water use. Some land may have to come out of irrigation. Some crop production may move to other parts of the country where there's more rainfall. These are extremely difficult issues that relate to people on the land and that have real consequences. But again, we haven't really stared it straight in the eye and begun to plan and to join a big region-wide discussion that accepts the reality, that gets away from the myth that the drought won't last. We can always find more water, do ocean desalination and bring the water hundreds of miles across the land. Maybe we'll have a pipeline from the Mississippi River into the Arizona desert. Got to kind of step down from all of these easy kind of fantasies and confront the real problem, which is what are we going to do now to rebalance demand and use and rebalance between urban and agriculture. That's what land use and land planning really ought to be about.
Well, it seems to happen just about every year in the West, where you've got this sort of game of chicken, thinking about the snowpack, right? But this really is reaching a crisis point in terms of the supplies being low and having to do something about it in the West. Is that right?
The Colorado River becomes sort of the poster child of this because the river flow is diminishing as a result of the drought and the decrease in runoff efficiency. Arizona, for example, which relies on the Colorado River, has cut its take from Lake Mead by 30%. And that figure is probably going to go up as Lake Mead, which is supplied by the Colorado River, continues to decline. The take through the aqueducts into central Arizona continues to decline. Now, it's pretty clear that the agriculture community itself says it looks like we may lose as much as 20 or 30% of the irrigated farmland. Now, the urban conservation cannot so call that. The cities are doing throughout the West really a very creative job of water conservation, reusing wastewater. They are buying up turf rights, that is saying to urban residents, let's cut down on watering. We don't need all that green lawn out there. They're really quite innovative, but they're only using 10% of the total water supply. So as the cities grow and conserve, their overall use is not going to go down. It just isn't. And that takes us back to finding a better balance between urban and agriculture.
Well, I think we've shown just in this short time how the climate crisis breaks down into these different challenges, each one requiring political fortitude and negotiation and innovation and perseverance. Equally clear that COP26 will be just the start of some really hard work. Bruce Babbitt, former Arizona governor and Interior Secretary, thank you for helping us all better understand what's at stake here.
Anthony, a pleasure to be with you.
Well, the Lincoln Institute is celebrating our 75th anniversary all this year. We started as the Lincoln Foundation in 1946, and we're taking the opportunity to step back and take stock in everything we do. You can learn more about our work in land, water, and climate by going to our website, lincolninst.edu, and navigating to our work. You can also check out the history of the organization and some of the special events we have planned by clicking on 75th Anniversary. Also follow us on Twitter. The handle is @LandPolicy. And that is it for this episode of the Land Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. I hope you'll rate, review, subscribe, and recommend the show to anyone interested in land, water, and climate, and all the issues we talked about on this show. Until next time, thanks for listening.